So welcome to the March episode of Discourse, where we take an RSP-style look at religion in the news. And our first guest this month is Vivian Asimos. Vivian, thank you for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm Vivian. I'm currently working at Durham University as a teaching assistant. I got my PhD there at Durham University in virtual storytelling, where I studied horror stories online. Pseudo-religion, I guess. I run the Religion and Popular Culture podcast, as well as working alongside the Theology, Religion, and Popular Culture Network.
Awesome. And our next guest is Dan Gorman. Thank you for joining us, Dan. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I am a history PhD candidate at the University of Rochester in the United States, studying spiritualism and in the 19th century and various scientists, journalists, and other sort of public investigators who were questioning its legitimacy or falsehood, and then what the stakes of that were for American culture.
That all sounds really interesting. My name is Theo Wildcroft. I'm an early career scholar. I completed my PhD with the Open University last year, and my thesis concerned the evolution of contemporary yoga culture, particularly some significant changes in the nature of authority and bureaucratic governance. And I'm fascinated more generally by bodies, religion, identity, and culture. So, small things, meaning making, little things like that. I have a chapter in the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Performance Philosophy, and my monograph manuscript is in progress at the moment. I help out with various bits and pieces, including the JBSR and other things. And mostly I hang out with a lot of yoga teachers, which is mostly what I'm going to be doing this weekend. So I think we can go straight into it. It's an interesting day to be recording. It's the 12th of March. It might be useful to say that for later, because the news is in terms of the coronavirus and things, is a very interesting place. It's a very interesting things happening at the moment, but we are not going to start with that. We're going to go straight to Dan with an interesting piece about the US Supreme Court.
Yes. So the story I'll be talking about today is from the Pew Research Center, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. They do a lot of large-scale opinion polls, not just about religion, but they're one of the few large think tanks that includes religion among the social trends that they monitor.
Right.
So they're trying to get a mix, I think, of quantitative and qualitative information about religion in this country. So anyway, the article by Dalia Fahmy, with religion-related rulings on the horizon, U.S. Christians see Supreme Court favorably, from March 3rd, 2020. The basic thesis of the article is that when looking at American demographic groups and bringing religion into it, it tends to be that white evangelical Christians are the most likely to view the Supreme Court favorably, followed also by Catholics, although the survey doesn't specify the race of the Catholics. There's some speculation that the positive beliefs are connected to the election or appointment of Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, both of whom were very conservative judges who are known to be pro-life. I don't know if they're Catholics, but they are some, more conservative form of Christian. And so there's speculation from the Pew staff that the appointment of two pro-life justices to the bench will make conservative Christians, particularly white conservative Christians, more fond of the court because they think they have the court on their side, which would be the ultimate goal of banning abortion in the United States. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so that's an interesting thing then. So rather than seeing the Supreme Court as an objective entity, if we can, with that problematic word objective, that what we're talking about here is almost a kind of an us and them situation, that there's our side and their side, and if we have enough of our people in there, then this is almost a kind of a crusading,
yes,
evangelical kind of mission.
I think I think it's interesting that you use the word crusade in particular. There is a major organization for evangelical Christians in colleges in the United States. It's called the Campus Crusade for Christ. So I think that speaks to that idea of we are fighting to preserve the values that we want to see in society. It is interesting, though, the Campus Crusade has renamed themselves as Crew. I think that's an attempt to sound less objectionable, but their mission stays the same.
Less objectionable, just more down with the kids. How are they spelling Crew? It strikes me as one of those names. It's a bit grim, a bit interesting.
Yes, CRU. This has been for several years now.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would consider that to be the cool kids on campus when I was a student. I don't know.
Well, but it depends on your audience, right? It depends, and I think that's what I think that's what the Pew survey is trying to capture, the perspectives that vary. Now, just share a couple other statistics that are worth mentioning. So we've established that most white evangelical Protestants want Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court case legalizing abortion, to be overturned. 6 in 10 white evangelical Protestants support that overturning of it. But when you look at the other religious groups listed here, even though, for instance, American Catholics have the stereotype of being pro-life, actually a significant majority, 68% of American Catholics, would like to see Roe v. Wade stay on the books. So that suggests a gap between priests who might be against abortion and then the people who show up to Mass every week. And of course, it's also notable that religiously unaffiliated people in general very much want to see abortion stay legal.
There's an interesting disconnect there between what we might consider to be the orthodoxy of a particular religious group and what the kind of, if you like, for want of a better word, the congregations involved do want to support. I can't remember exactly where it's from now, but there's a fantastic statistic in a survey of religious attitudes in the UK from the 1980s, which found that 20% of people who self-identified as Christians also believed in reincarnation. Which is really fascinating, because if you reverse that statistic and you say 80% of Christians believe in reincarnation, is reincarnation then a Christian belief? Or, what has the primacy? What has the authority? Is it the kind of circle community leaders and priests and so on, or is it the kind of congregations en masse? And what does that mean for us? I'm kind of interested. I'm aware, Vivian, obviously you've moved to the right side of the Atlantic now with us, but I'm aware that how does it, specifically being a woman as well, growing up in these kinds of environments, how do these kinds of things feel in terms of these culture wars around bodily autonomy and things? I think it's an interesting question to ask somebody who has that little bit of distance, but also a connection.
Yeah, well, it's actually really interesting because when I was, God, I can't remember how old I was. I must have been in uni doing my undergrad, but I had a friend of mine who actually decided to get an abortion, and I had to drive her to her appointment and everything. And there was the worry in my friend that she would turn up and there would be the, crowd of people there to yell at her and protest against her. And she was really worried, and we had brought like a big hoodie so she could throw it over herself so no one would be able to see her. And we had made all these preparations, but it was a private property, so they were able to keep people from standing there, which was really good for her. So I've got kind of a weird relationship with this as somebody who, I haven't personally, but having been quite close to the personal experience of needing to engage with it. And of course, this was all done in the part of Florida that thinks it's southern Georgia, which is a very important kind of location to place this in, that maybe people in some places in the U.S. might not feel it as strongly as other places do. So that's something to keep in mind. One of the things that I find really interesting looking at this, particularly that one kind of, this article has very fancy looking, kind of breakdowns of the demographics and stuff.
Yeah.
Easy to look at. And I know that it's only semi-related to what they're talking about, but this category of the unaffiliated, I kind of want to explore a little bit more, because I don't know what they mean by that. I don't know. I know that later they have a thing kind of breakdown of atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. But I don't know where any of the other religions fall on this. I don't know what the survey looked like, because that's always something really important to keep in mind when it comes to the way that people are responding. Particularly, I think about, my family is a bit of a weird case study, which is why I always like them, where my mother grew up Catholic, probably still is in a lot of her beliefs, but doesn't belong to the Catholic Church. So what would she answer? Would she answer just general Christian? Would she answer Catholic? Or would she just go ahead and say, well, nothing in particular, because that's easier than trying to negotiate her own Christian identity? Because if you can only pick one, or if they're that clearly laid out, are you Protestant? Are you Catholic? Are you white evangelical? What do you click if you either don't care? I know people who are very floaty Christians. They kind of go to whatever church they like that's in their area, rather than what that specific denomination is. I also know that there's lots of Catholics that determine themselves as Catholics, but not necessarily belonging to the Catholic Church, and they tie that identity in with other religious groups. So Catholic Buddhists. I've also heard atheistic Catholic. So, how does that breakdown happen? Because I think, it's just interesting I think this kind of is a demonstration of why getting a really closer look at surveys can sometimes be really important.
And also that actually that kind of to put that alongside the kind of deeper qualitative work where you follow a few people and really go deep into some of those stories is kind of interesting as well. I mean, from what you're saying, it's kind of it brings to mind the fact that there is actually a difference between having kind of a sense of your own identity in terms of a particular religious grouping, and then would you claim that religious grouping in a sense that feels political. And the more that religious stances of different kinds seem to be tied to political stances, the more problematic that can feel sometimes for people. And one of the first things they say about this is the connection between different religious identities and Democrat and Republican kind of leanings or affiliations, so that and I think that there's a connection to this one identity, with this one issue, that it's really interesting to me that of all the possible issues that could be of importance to someone who considered themselves to be Christian, that abortion is the one of the moment, whereas at other times and in other jurisdictions, people with theoretically the same viewpoints and theoretically the same beliefs may have felt that to be much less important than other issues, and how it is that in the States that it is the one issue you have to have an opinion on, right? It's that and gun ownership, like you've got to. but I think that specifically in terms of religious identity and your status and your opinion of abortion, there's a very clear link there. It doesn't seem culturally even possible to not have to have a religious identity and not have a stance on abortion in the States. You've kind of got to know one way or the other, haven't you? And I wonder if there are people who are kind of a bit like, I'm not sure.
There is some of that.
That happens. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'd say, there are cases of that. There are some public figures who say privately, I believe I am pro-life, but that's my religious opinion, and I separate secular law from that.
Yeah. Which is what would make sense to many people. I think I don't, not necessarily make sense logically, but I think that it's that kind of attitude is much more common in European contexts. In my experience, that European and UK contexts, that people can have very strong beliefs, but that there is that much stronger separation between that and the belief that the state should follow that same stance. That's an interesting thing. Yeah, and I'm sure the debate will run and run. I guess this does allow us to bring us to, although it's a very different issue, I'm kind of keen at this point to bring in Vivian's piece, because I think this has the same connection between what's your religious identity and then what's your relationship to the wider culture and how you're seen and perceived by the wider culture, what your relationship to those things are. So, Vivian, you found us at very last minute, you found us a very cute article to look at.
I did. I went to some of my tried and true places to look at that would get me away from talking about the coronavirus, which, so I went to the Wild Hunt, which is a pagan news website. And this one is from January, so which is about a whole lot of outrage that happened over a particular book review that was published in the Independent. And the book review, I think it's semi-fair to say that it took a somewhat pejorative view of the pagan, particularly witchcraft community. There's even a section in there in her review, I believe it was her review, which stated that, she kind of just assumed that all, witches would shun science because of, their reliance on these kinds of things, which is, of course, very inaccurate to how a lot of the community sees themselves. And so there was quite a large reaction against this, particularly kind of saying that if this exact same book review was published on, say, Christianity or Islam or Judaism, then, it wouldn't have been probably published. And the outcry would definitely have been listened to, that perhaps it's because of the community itself that it's being kind of shoved under the rug, which is something that's interesting. But what I found most interesting, particularly as a scholar, was due to the outpouring of complaints that was coming into the Independent, they started sending out this automatic message to anybody complaining about that article. And it's quite lengthy, but I only want to read this one section of it, which I think is really interesting to think about as a scholar, where they say, right, okay. I acknowledge that many disagree strongly with the journalist's account of experience of putting the book's recommendations into practice. I have, of course, noted the explanations you have provided as to why the reporter has misunderstood, yada, yada, yada. And then they say, however, you will not be in a position to dispute the writer's own personal experiences or the impression which she was left with during the week. And I find this a really interesting comment, particularly when it comes to participant observation and the types of research that we do as scholars, and this you can kind of bring it into that emic-etic, insider-outsider debate of, if this is what I've experienced as a scholar, how much am I allowed to say it, even if the community would disagree? How much am I able to say, well, this is my experience, and because I'm a scholar, I'm able to communicate that properly and get this published and have lots of people read it, and you can't really say anything because this is my experience as a researcher. I think it opens up a lot of those kinds of conversations, and I don't know if anyone has had that kind of experience of fighting with the community, because most of my fights have been for my community. So I haven't had that, but then it makes me wonder that if I did experience something that maybe I wasn't quite as favorable towards with the community that I was studying, how would I respond to that? Or would I just ignore it when it comes to the reporting of it? And if I do ignore it, is that proper research?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to slightly hijack this, because this is of great importance to my work, because my participant observation and my field work was on a community of practice. It was a community that has a practice that they do on a virtually daily basis, most of them, which, different forms of yoga. And there are, part of my thesis was examining the diversity of possible practices that can fall under that umbrella. And as a result, what it meant is that my fieldwork involved exploring a number of those practices. Now, there were two things involved in that. On the one hand, I really got into the idea of not just the positionality of the researcher, but the previous embodied experience of the researcher. Because in dance studies and movement studies, you often have the idea of the expert mover, that in the course of learning a practice, whether it's a kind of a movement practice or a sensory practice, over many, many years, that changes a human being's ability to comprehend what it is they're doing and what it is they're seeing when they see other people do the same movements. So there's this idea of expert movers, and that dancers, for example, are expert movers, and they know things about the human body and the way the human body moves and feels that non-dancers can't appreciate by just doing something once, which is, exactly what we're talking about here, dropping in for a week. And I was saying, well, it's interesting if you apply that to something like yoga, which is a practice that builds up over years and decades. So I had a decade or more of experience with the practice, but it was of particular forms of practice. So through the fieldwork itself, I was constantly having to interrogate not just what my the participants in research were feeling and experiencing, but what I was experiencing. And was that down to any insight that I had because I had this embodied experience? Was it affected by my previous experiences and my own preferences? I ended up doing styles of yoga that normally I wouldn't go anywhere near because I don't like them and I don't enjoy them, and how did that affect how I was in the space? And there are no kind of easy answers, but I'm really fond of, just before we bring it back to this, I'm really fond of, there's a piece by Richard Karp on this about academic bodies, and the academic bodies are disciplined in specific ways. And that, an academic body that is used to sitting still for long periods of time without a lot of natural light and with a lot of computer screens, then goes into the field with, a bunch of people in a particular environment and attempts to understand what they're doing. And I think we have a similar sense here, right, of a journalist who obviously doesn't normally do this kind of thing, saying, well, I've tried these practices for a week and it's obviously nonsense. It's kind of interesting in terms of what weight we give to those different perspectives, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but the other thing I think is interesting here, and it'll be interesting to hear you speak to more about, is the sensitivity of pagan communities to how the wider world perceives them.
Yeah, I think that's, I think it's definitely a community that is very aware of how the other, to kind of put it in a much more blunt format, how the other views them. And this might be due to a lot of different factors, both historical as well as media centered. Even just looking at a lot of popular culture, things like the Sabrina the Teenage Witch, which does a very poor job, I think, of really exploring these conversations. And as entertaining as some of these pop culture elements might be, understanding the damage that it might be doing to a community group. So I think they're very aware of it. And because of that, I think they're very ready to respond in ways like this, which I don't think every community would be prepared for. I think that particularly, especially because it was a book review, the article, which I don't know how many, say evangelical white Christians, to think about our other article, are reading book reviews on evangelical Christianity, while, witches might be spending a lot more time in those kinds of spaces.
Yeah.
So there's something really interesting about the context of the community itself, in understanding both their reaction as well as, their understanding of their place within, this context.
Yeah, if you've got on the one hand kind of evangelical Christians are attempting, essentially, not just attempting, but actually succeeding in influencing the actual Supreme Court of a nation, compared to, how have we been portrayed in this one book review in the back pages of The Independent. It's a very different, it's not just very different concerns, it's a very different level of concern, isn't it, in many ways. I can't see many pagan groups attempting to get people onto the Supreme Court, really.
I'm sure they'd like to try.
It's interesting to imagine 150 years from now, if the United States still exists, will paganism have flourished in its various forms into a major religious organization? Because right now, we're talking about a few million people who may identify as pagan or engage in some of the practices. They haven't quite reached, I hate to use the phrase media saturation because it's problematic, but I think as long as people in the United States assume religion as default must look like Christianity, it will be difficult to get into the mindset of a completely different practice-based religion like paganism. And and again, paganism isn't just one thing. There are many different forms of it.
Absolutely. Yes, very much so, and that is as big an issue as anything else. Having kind of spent some time in these spaces, getting pagans to agree would be an interesting one. I know that I'm sure this is used of other pagan groups as well, but I know that most Druid groups, for example, have the running joke that if you ask 3 Druids what Druidry is, you'll get 4 different answers.
But I do think that there is a certain amount of that does exist, though, in these quote unquote world religions that everyone kind of relies on. I remember having a conversation with my father about the Trinity is something that I've never quite been able to wrap my head around. And I was having a conversation with him about it, and he made some comment about the Holy Ghost, and his wife interrupted and said, "You don't believe in that." Which is obviously therefore 2 people who are ascribed to the same exact branch of Christianity, not even just saying Christianity in general, that are having a disagreement on a very core aspect of their own belief. But I think it's a lot easier for people to say Christianity, Jesus, cool, we get it, and not push that further of saying, well, what does it mean to you? What does it mean to be Christian? Which I think when you ask a pagan or a Druid as a more specific kind of thing of what does it mean to be Druid, that's what they're answering.
Yeah. I think you're right. I'm also aware that historically speaking, there's a guy I know who's actually head of the Anglesey Druid Order, and he talks about his grandmother. That if you're looking kind of a generation or 2 generations ago, he's saying, nobody would say they were pagan, but they would all leave milk out for the pixies, and they would do all these things that now we would claim as kind of pagan practice, but it's just what you did. But they're good Christian women, and I mean, I know that if I look at my grandparents kind of growing up and the things that happened then in theory as part of Christian practice were actually, they were quite they were at the very least folkloric in form. Kind of like specific walks up to specific hills on specific days of the year and things like that, which certainly weren't sanctified by Christian worship, but would always happen on Easter Sunday or on Whitsun or whatever it might be, So these, as we know, the closer you look beneath the survey into actual practice and belief, the fuzzier the picture gets, right?
And the article that Vivian shared, it was quite interesting to read because last summer I taught a course on new religious movements in the United States. And the course was a little bit of a hodgepodge because I was talking about movements that started here, but also movements that were introduced to the U.S. So, what new is could be pitched in many ways. But we talked about witchcraft, modern witchcraft as part of it. And because I wanted to bring in some guest speakers, I reached out to a neighboring college, which actually just hired a pagan chaplain. And that was a contentious thing, hiring that position. And she came and she brought artifacts or objects from her rituals, and she talked about it. And I think it really helped my students to think about it tangibly and what this looks like as an actual religion. And it's not some creepy thing. This is just something we do. We don't need to be afraid of it. But it's a different group's practice. But I still think there's questions about what gets taken seriously as religion or not by scholars. And I think it's changing. I think there's a lot more openness to studying new movements, but witchcraft's always been kind of on the edge of what's acceptable, what isn't, partly because of the connotation. And I've noticed also in some of the studies of witchcraft, at least by journalists, there tends to be a sort of gotcha tone, studying Gerald Gardner and other British people who contributed to modern paganism and saying, oh, they made all this up, and there are, yes, legitimate scholarly questions about where Gerald Gardner was getting his sources from. But then there's the question of, does this not have value for the tradition people are inventing, regardless of where it comes from? I mean, look at the contested origins of the Gospels and all the ones that didn't make the final cut. So I think a lot of this
or
is
the
just
Mormons,
exactly,
or the Mormons, for that matter,
which is still contested in the United States by some people. So what I'm getting at is a lot of this comes down to sort of your first cause, your premises. Are you willing to think through them? A lot of people aren't taught to think that way. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It's just they haven't been asked to question, what do you assume is religion?
Yeah, well, as someone who studies popular culture, I highly agree.
Mm-hmm. You're speaking. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir, so to speak, right here. I think that it is a little bit more acceptable to study this stuff in the UK, and I think we're moving beyond a sense of kind of even moving beyond the sense of different religions into, what are the commonalities, what are the common kind of threads here that run through things, and to that end, actually, it brings me really neatly to the kind of two pieces I wanted to look at, because there was a piece in the Guardian this week about an Oxford dean being accused of failing to report child sexual assault. Now, in and of itself, I think the story is of not necessarily massive importance, but it is part of a much wider issue that we know about in terms of historical abuse within, not exclusively, but within Christian institutions, amongst other religious institutions, and that historical abuse starting to kind of make moves towards justice and towards institutional reform in ways that it hasn't been able to in the past. And that is an issue, has been, an issue, particularly within the Catholic Church, but also now within other Christian organizations. But what a lot of people may not realize is that the same moves and the same threads are playing out as we speak within yoga communities. So people may or may not, we can argue for long periods of time as to whether yoga is inherently religious or not, but there are yoga institutions that have the same patterns of abuse, interpersonal abuse, specifically interpersonal sexual abuse, the abuse of vulnerable students rather than vulnerable congregants, and the same institutional patterns of denial and cover up and failure to safeguard and just failure to believe that this is even possible, and very, very similar debates about can you separate the ideal of the person at the front of the congregation or the front of the class or the front of the ashram who is saying all these things about ethical standards and so on and so forth, and how to live a good life, and if you pray right or you do the right yoga practices, you will become a better person, and then the discovery that they themselves are inherently kind of corrupted in some way. And how do you reconcile that if you believe that the practices or the prayer or whatever it might be allows you to live a better life? And it is fascinating how similar the stories play out in different kind of religious and spiritual groups. We are at the point now where, to my knowledge, there isn't a single major prominent yoga lineage or school that has not had a significant abuse scandal in the last 10 years, basically. We are now at that point. The most recent being in Kundalini yoga community is coming to terms with historical abuse, and the Shivananda yoga community as well. So, and yet most people have no idea that's going on.
This article hits home for me. I was raised Catholic, and earlier Vivian was talking about cultural versus practicing Catholics. Well,
Yes.
one of the main reasons why I'm alienated from the church is because of, and this is me speaking more as myself, not my scholarly hat, but the credibility of, who do we trust? In the church I grew up in, there was a visiting priest who was accused and was removed, although I had to do some digging recently to try to, find out, because we never were told one way or another. But more recently, the head of the church was laicized. And because in New York State, there's these lawsuits, a 1-year statute of limitations lifted to try to catch these guys who did this to children. And, as part of the data that's being released, another priest from my home church, the one who was always so good with kids, who used to do the puppet shows for us when we were little, well, it turns out he had a claim settled. So, I think there is a danger. I mean, it was so intense in the Catholic Church that I think people think, oh, this is only unique to Catholicism. But just this past month in the American Catholic Studies Journal, the historian Julie Byrne ran an article talking about how we shouldn't assume that this is a uniquely Catholic problem. Just as you're talking about, Theo, these problems of abuse can happen in any tradition. And that doesn't mean don't study its particular manifestation in a tradition like Kundalini Yoga, Roman Catholicism. But at the same time, think, what are the larger structures, the abuse of power, the desire for control that can manifest in any organization? Look at the American Boy Scouts. They were going bankrupt because of all the abuse claims they're settling.
And I also think, to bring it closer to home, I think it also one of the interesting questions that I struggle with is, what is our responsibility as scholars when it comes to these kinds of things? Because certainly in terms of yoga studies, there's I know they regret this now, but the book Gurus of Modern Yoga has a sentence in its introduction that says, I'm paraphrasing, but it basically says, abuses by gurus are not the primary focus of this book. And you think, why? Like when there are that many accusations, then, and that many reports, then this starts to be something that is at the very least systemic, even if it's not endemic. So therefore, surely it's part of part of the kinds of patterns that we want to be talking about. And how do you not talk about those patterns if they are so obvious and so repeated, and what's our... But it's uncomfortable for us, right? Because as you said, Dan, you start to take a personal position with regards to it. How does that then touch on my personal ethics about what I feel to be right and wrong? And how does that relate to my positionality as a researcher and as a scholar?
I have a 2-word response: mandated reporter.
Yeah.
Well, I also wonder how much it impacts whatever other research you can do. I mean, can you imagine if you, Theo, were talking to some young upstart PhD student who wanted to do something on yoga that had absolutely nothing to do with this, and talking about it would be, kind of completely a tangent that had nothing to do with the rest of their research. Do they address it? Do they not address it? Do they address it only to say that they're not going to address it? At what point do you negotiate those things? Because I know that was a decision that I had to make for my community, although my community didn't perpetrate anything, but they were associated with violent actions. And so I still had to address it, but to what extent did I address it? But you have to kind of make those negotiations within your own research.
Well, I think you make those negotiations specifically with regards to what you're talking about, which is how there's how much of an impact has it had, and there's growing evidence. I think now we are starting to study it that these are not tangential to the history of modern yoga, that at least within yoga, that these acts have fundamentally altered the trajectory of modern yoga in various specific ways, and that therefore it's actually very difficult increasingly to talk about yoga without talking about them. There's even a possibility, it's a hypothesis, that the history of touch in yoga, so when yoga teachers will touch students to adjust them and move them, that didn't happen in the pre-modern era, and that touch starts to happen in very specific places at very specific times, and the teachers that were involved in the yoga movements where touch started to come in were known to be abusive in different ways. Not all of them, but many of them. So at that point, you have to kind of offer the hypothesis that abuse is part of the history of adjustment itself, of touch itself within yoga. Whereas I think in your case it's different, because it's much easier to say, well, these communities have a reputation for violence, but actually in reality that's not what's playing out here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think my community is a slightly different example case. I was just more kind of saying that I definitely had to make that wasn't even as extreme as some of these other cases. And so I can't imagine if I was, say, for example, studying Catholicism at the moment, how much do I devote my research to talking about child abuse scandals, even if my research has nothing to do with child abuse scandals.
Yeah. Well, my research has nothing to do with guru abuse, and yet it's 90% of what I end up talking about. I made that specific decision not to go down that road, and here I am. I think it's tricky. I'm aware, partly because I've put an abstract in for it, but there is a conference in Chester that I would like to kind of big up a little bit, coming up in September, on I think they're calling it spiritual abuse. So I think that's going to be a really interesting conference, specifically talking about these issues cross-denominationally. And I'm hoping, I've proposed a panel on yoga, and I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to do, in the hope that we are all allowed to travel by September.
I hope so.
Let us hope.
Which kind of, time is slightly going on as ever, and I guess we should, at least in passing, talk about the coronavirus and the impact it's having on all sorts, not just of religious communities, but the entire academic community, kind of as we speak, really.
Yes.
So
I am currently in the mode of being incredibly worried about students.
Yes.
On many different levels. For one, we had strikes here in the UK that took up quite a lot of this term, and then at Durham we just announced that the final week of term, which was the only week that they really had this term for lectures, is now being cancelled. However, it currently stands that the exam is still in place. So there's obviously lots of concerns going on at the moment of just from an academic standpoint. I also have concerns as an international student when I was here of the international students, and with travel restrictions internationally already in place for a lot of countries, and now you're closing down sections of the university. Where do international students go?
Yes.
Are they stuck? Do they have a home? Are they going to have a place at the uni? These kinds of questions are really important to be asking and making sure that we're addressing, in order to make sure that no one falls through the cracks and is left abandoned by essentially everyone. Also thinking about students, a lot of unis are putting their stuff available online, but many students don't have access to the internet at their homes. What do we do for those students? And I have been hearing that essentially the library will still be open, but that is defeating the purpose of safeguarding your students.
And the librarians.
This.
And the librarians, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I guess the numbers will be smaller, but you're still if your concern is putting students at risk of illness, this isn't really helping the situation. So I think that as things go forward, anybody who is involved in these kinds of decisions, or at least has a hand in talking to your students even a little bit, try to make sure that your students have a home that they are comfortable going home to, because some people do have a home that they don't feel comfortable going home to, and make sure that they have somewhere that they do feel comfortable going to in this time.
How about you, Dan? How's it over there?
Well, it's been quite interesting. It was one conference after another was getting canceled this week, and yesterday my university just announced that we're moving all classes online for the rest of the semester. Now, some schools are just doing it for a month and then they'll reevaluate on April 15th, right around when taxes are due. Really, but my school's saying to the end of the semester, and like many other colleges, they're evacuating the dorms. Although exceptions are made because they realize not everyone can leave. Now, that's particularly fraught in the United States because of the so-called Muslim ban, which recently was expanded to include even more countries. So that if some of these students go home, back to their home countries, they might not be able to come back to finish their degree ever. Or at least as long as as long as President Trump is still in power and this remains on the books. So I'm thinking about that, students who can't leave because they have nowhere else to go, also stateless persons, particularly the Palestinians. Other things that come to mind also with the sudden, this isn't religious per se, but the sudden move to online teaching, and everyone, well, not everyone in the United States, but a significant majority of people want to use this app called Zoom for business conferencing to teach.
Yeah.
And it is a pretty good app. I just hope that they have the server space to accommodate, an entire country's worth of classes. And everyone's saying go online, but I'm waiting for, again, I'm not an expert on IT, but I'm waiting for there to be connectivity trouble because of so many people trying to use these networks.
Well, I'm a geek by marriage. My other half is currently quietly smug about the fact that he works from home with large boxes of electronic equipment elsewhere in the world, and so far it hasn't affected his job in any way, shape, or form. But I think it's it's one of the joys of having a fairly antisocial profession to begin with. He's fine.
And now the whole world's invading.
Yeah. I think once we get an influx of users, I think that might be a different thing. But also a lot of the people that I'm working with are either are differently vulnerable. So if you're talking about kind of yoga teachers and so on, and various kinds of countercultural, almost below the radar professions, that this is a lot of therapists, a lot of instructors of different kinds. We are all self-employed. So there's no safety net. So for example, and it's very difficult to know what the right thing to do. So, for example, there's a training I'm going on this weekend, which which has taken over a year to plan. That involves people coming from all over the country. The person doing the training is coming from overseas, and do we cancel it? Do we not cancel it? The people running it probably can't afford to cancel it because they're not making masses of money. So unless the government actually puts things in place that make it seem culturally acceptable to stop doing things, then it can be quite difficult for self-employed people to say, well, I'm going to take an ethical stance, when you could lose not just a week's work or a month's work, but actually you could lose clients and opportunities forever. And I have friends who are musicians and things who in terms of festivals and those kinds of things, like they're insured for all kinds of bad weather and God knows what else, meteor strikes and God knows what, but they are not. They're not insured for the government deciding you can't have gatherings of more than 1,000 people. At the same time, more and more of the work that a lot of yoga teachers in particular do, as in many places in the world, is therapeutic work. So a lot of the people that the people I work are coming into contact with are immune compromised in different ways. Some of the people I work with on a weekly basis are immune compromised in different ways. I've had at least one student email and say, who's nearly 80, and said, I'm going to stay home. I was at a respite centre for profoundly disabled children last night. What I'm taking from one of those places to the next is particularly because the work that I do is hands-on, is somewhat worrying. And who knows? And I guess it might be a slightly tangential link, but I'm struck by the biggest advice of all being about washing your hands, and of how traditional that is in many religious contexts. This idea that what keeps you safe is washing your hands. And I know that a friend of mine whose mother kind of grew up in Ireland and fairly kind of working class communities said, when we were growing up, our health service was washing your hands.
Yes.
That's the thing you do, and of how prevalent that hand washing is in different religious cultures and cultural contexts.
And
I guess it's a reminder of that.
I would say also, and I realize we're well past time, but I'm also thinking about hospital chaplains and medical ethicists who, at least in the United States, there are more of these medical ethic consultants who hospitals keep on staff. And I'm thinking about, my grandmother, this is, 70 years ago, but when her mother was dying and, who gets the oxygen tent back when they had, they put sort of a plastic tent over you, right? Who gets it and who doesn't. And, of course, we have much more technology today. People don't usually use oxygen tents anymore. But, if suddenly we get millions of patients and we don't have the equipment, then deciding and comforting, they're going to have a really tough time.
Yeah. It gets tricky. Okay, well, I'm sure we can keep going kind of, for all day really, but I think David would be sad if we did that. So yeah, I think we can bring it to a close, hoping everyone stays safe, including you guys. Yeah, let's hope that 2 months from now it's all over and it'll feel like a storm in a teacup, really.
Oh, we've got to throw a huge party.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everyone can touch their faces.
Yes.
Awesome. Yes. Are you finding that? I'm finding my husband and I are like, you're touching your face. That's the one thing. It's so annoying. Anyway, so yeah, I just want to thank you both for joining me today. Especially kind of fairly last minute gathering this together. With one thing or another, and I hope our listeners enjoyed the episode. I hope we gave people a few things to be thoughtful about, and Discourse will be back in a month or so regardless. Even if we're all stuck at home, we can still record podcasts. That's the good news. So thank you Dan, and thank you Vivian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. All right.
The RSP is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Marek Sullivan and Rebecca Barrett-Fox, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop, and video editing by Jonathan Tuckett.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.